Hello, my name is John Coonley. I am the owner of the Coonley Law Firm, a professional limited liability company located in Austin, Texas. And today I'm going to recap the seminar I gave on maximizing your business's value. The first thing we talked about was having your corporate formalities in place. As I mentioned in the seminar, there was a large portion of my clients who, when they come in for any sort of legal help, the first thing I do is I look up their state filings. And often their company is not properly formulated or it's not properly maintained. So what we look for is making sure that the certificates of formation or articles of incorporation are in place, that the operating agreement in the case of an LLC, the bylaws or the partnership agreement, depending on the structure, is in place, and that all the corporate formalities, such as keeping corporate minutes, making sure that stock certificates have been issued, and that the stock transfer ledger is up to date. Often, when major events have happened, it's required that sometimes those events are ratified by the board of directors or by the members in the case of an LLC, and they've not done so. It's not that they were trying to do bad business, it's just that they didn't really think about it. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and ratify all those actions. It's not that big of a deal, it can be done. But it slows up the process and it costs money. So it's always best practice to make sure that you're following proper company or corporate formalities as you go. The seminar wasn't comprehensive enough to really talk about different ways to value a business. However, it can be said that almost every single business valuation requires at least a look at various financial statements. Often gross revenue, cash flow, discounted cash flow, net revenue, things of that nature. In small business, often people don't keep very good books, or don't keep any books at all, or they do some sort of variation between maintaining records kind of according to their own system, but in a way that maybe doesn't make sense to other people. So it's important that, particularly if you're planning on selling your business, that you maintain good records so that you can show a buyer things they're going to want to see. We discussed in the seminar how in sometimes very large purchases or in stock purchases, there's going to be audited statements, things of that nature. In small business purchases and transactions, it's going to almost always be an asset purchase. From that standpoint, the tax records aren't nearly as important, but the financial records still are. One of the valuation methods that I talked about during the seminar was more or less taking the seller's word for what the company was making, but then making the seller finance the transaction, or at least a part of the transaction, and then having the right to offset against some of the money due to the seller in the event that the company severely underperformed. This is, in my opinion, a pretty good way to keep the seller honest, because they know that if they're misrepresenting the numbers, or if they maybe are just guessing at the numbers, that eventually they're not going to get paid for at least part of their error, whether it's intentional or not. When it comes to company assets, there are basically three real categories. First, you have your client or your customer base. Second, you have your tangible assets, such as machinery, inventory, things of that nature, which are generally pretty easy to value. Third, you have your personnel. And fourth, you've got your intellectual property. When it comes to personnel, essentially what we're talking about is managers and employees and people who help make the company run. So from that standpoint, there are a couple things to think about. One of the things to think about is what's going to happen to those employees if the company that they're currently working for sells all the assets and then subsequently fires them. And second, what's going to happen to the value of the other assets if they're contained more or less in the employees' minds. For instance, a couple of the managers decide they don't need to work for the acquiring purchaser. Instead, they can go start their own company. And they already have things such as trade secrets, they already have customer lists, things like that. And there's really not a lot of people to hold them accountable because their original agreement was with the company, which is now planning on dissolving. A couple different things to think about here are, number one, what would be the appropriate thing to do in terms of keeping information that key employees have confidential? And number two, as a purchaser, what do you want to do with those employees? During the seminar, we really didn't go into too many specifics about different and creative ways around this problem. However, I'm going to give a different seminar and hopefully a different recap of that seminar about that same issue. Often, in small businesses, what was once personal property becomes company property, not necessarily by design, but just kind of by default. For instance, personal truck becomes a company truck, or a personal computer becomes a company computer, so on and so forth. It's easy to see how something like that could happen, especially if a company starts as a small hobby, more or less, and then grows into something more substantial, and there wasn't a bunch of company assets purchased on the onset. Another situation I've seen that touches on this same topic is, what about the situation where somebody hires independent contractors for long-term contracts, and those independent contractors bring their own equipment, say their own computer or their own tools, and then it becomes time to sell the company. These independent contractors, number one, are not employees of the company, and number two, have brought their own materials and their own tools. So those tools don't belong to the company, they belong to the individuals. Now, what happens in a situation where the company becomes reliant on those tools and the independent contractor is long-term? Eventually, perhaps, lines get blurred between who owns what. Unfortunately, I didn't really have the chance to talk about contractual rights and obligations during the seminar. I'll briefly touch on it now. The two biggest things I see, number one, in an asset purchase, the lease and the contract with third parties can both potentially be jeopardized. And that's because leases are generally between a landlord and the company operating, and sometimes guaranteed by the person who owns the company. And what this owner will do on behalf of his company is he'll go ahead and he'll install fixtures, and he'll build out a space that works perfectly for his purposes, and he'll make all sorts of improvements and optimizations of his leased space. And those improvements and those optimizations are required to efficiently and effectively run the business that the purchaser is hoping to run. The problem becomes, what happens if the landlord doesn't like the purchaser and doesn't want the purchaser to move into the space that the previous owner had? Well, there's only one of two options, unless the lease is totally assignable. And the first option is buy the building, and the second option is get the approval of the landlord. This can potentially come up. Normally it's not a big deal. It can definitely be a major red flag, and it's definitely something to consider the next time you sign a commercial lease. The other major issue you find, or that I've seen, is the contracts between the company and third parties, particularly if those contracts are for value. Let me give you an example. Say a person owns a vending company where they vend sodas and candy bars and things like that. And this person then wants to sell. And it's not a stock sale or a company sale, it's an asset sale. What this person will do is he'll sell all of his machines, which he can do, to the purchaser. However, the real value of this company is not necessarily a bunch of vending machines, but where those vending machines are located and the arrangement that the original company had with the location where those vending machines are located. The question becomes, what happens to those contracts, and can the new owner legally step into the shoes of the old owner? Again, this has to do with assignment, and it's something to very carefully consider, both as a purchaser and as an owner when you're originally setting up your company. Bruce Johnson, a licensed intellectual property attorney, gave a great presentation on patents, trademarks, and copyrights, and how they interplay with the asset purchase of a company or the stock purchase of a company, and how it interplays with the inventors, and how it interplays with potentially independent contractors, and how there's an extreme importance for properly worded work-for-hire contracts, particularly with assignment contingencies. Because I'm not a licensed intellectual property attorney, I'm not going to paraphrase what he said, but he indicated he'd be more than happy to give another presentation on exactly this at some other time. There was a lot of discussion about the various tax consequences of an asset purchase or a stock purchase. The majority of our discussion, particularly at the end of the seminar, centered around this idea of depreciation and depreciation recapture. And the basics are, as a company depreciates assets, they're taking those deductions during the course of the depreciation. When they go to sell those assets, if they sell them for greater than their depreciated value, they need to pay recapture tax on that. Doug Tidwell did a great job of explaining this in depth, but what it basically comes down to is a seller would like to sell his depreciated assets for as little as possible, and then would like to attribute the rest of the sale to things like goodwill. A buyer would like to pay very, very little for goodwill because it takes longer to write off. Purchase price allocation is one of the main negotiating points in any asset sale, but it's less relevant in a stock sale because in a stock sale, the purchaser is stepping into the shoes of the previous owner. I'd be happy to answer any follow-up questions you might have. Thank you for watching, and you can get a hold of me at contact@coonleylawatx.com or at 512-987-9407.